Jason made the massive decision to buy his very first house at the age of 28. He did this primarily because that is what society tells you that you are supposed to do at that stage of life. Over several years of disciplined saving, he had managed to put aside $42,000 specifically for a down payment. He was truly and deeply tired of the constant feeling that he was simply throwing his hard-earned money away on rent every month. On top of his own feelings, his parents were constantly in his ear, asking him when he was finally going to stop renting and start building some real equity for his future. The house he eventually found cost $420,000 and was located in a suburb of Denver. He put down his $42,000, which was exactly 10% of the purchase price, and he financed the entire remaining balance at an interest rate of 6.8%. His baseline mortgage payment alone came out to $2,470 every single month. But the costs did not stop there. When you add in the property taxes at $420 and the homeowner's insurance at $180, and the homeowners association fees at $215, his total monthly housing cost reached $3,285. Before he decided to buy this house, his rent had been only $1,900 for a very nice two-bedroom apartment. That apartment was actually situated 8 minutes closer to his office than his new home. Jason did not actually take the time to run the hard numbers. He just believed what everyone seems to know, which is that buying is always better than renting because rent is seen as throwing money away while a mortgage is viewed as building equity. Now we look at the situation exactly 4 years later. Jason has spent approximately $157,000 on his total housing costs. His home is currently worth about $445,000, which is a very modest increase in a market that has cooled down significantly since the day he bought it. His remaining mortgage balance stands at $352,000. On paper, this means his equity is $93,000. But there is a hidden mathematical reality that Jason does not realize. If he had simply kept renting that apartment at $1,900 a month and invested the difference of $1,385 into an index fund returning 8%, he would have approximately $81,000 in investments. If you add back his original $42,000 down payment, which would have grown to about $57,000 in that same index fund, his total liquid net worth would be around $138,000. Jason has $93,000 in home equity. However, his alternative liquid wealth would have been $138,000. This means he is exactly $45,000 poorer than if he had just kept renting. To make it even worse, he cannot access any of that equity without selling the house or taking on more debt. Jason did not build wealth by buying. He actually destroyed it. The worst part is that he still believes he made the smart financial decision because nobody ever showed him the actual math. My name is Kyle, and I spend way too much time thinking about the rent versus buy decision that most people get catastrophically wrong. If you are renting and feeling pressure to buy, or if you just bought and something feels off about the math, or if you are trying to figure out when buying actually makes sense, then make sure to hit that subscribe button. What I am about to show you is a simple calculation that will tell you exactly when to stop renting. It will probably reveal that the right time is much later than everyone around you is currently saying. I call it the 5% rule, and it is the break-even calculator that nobody in real estate wants you to know about. Here is the fundamental lie you have been told about renting: that rent is throwing money away while mortgage payments are building equity. This framing is so deeply embedded in our culture that questioning it feels almost heretical. Your parents said it, your coworkers say it, every real estate agent, mortgage broker, and home improvement show reinforces it constantly. But here is what most people do not realize. When you own a home, you are also throwing money away. You are just throwing it away in different directions that are less visible than a rent check. The 5% rule captures the total unrecoverable costs of home ownership and compares them directly to the unrecoverable costs of renting. When you own a home, you pay property taxes. That money is just gone, and it is not building any equity. This typically costs around 1% of the home's value every single year. Then you pay for maintenance and repairs. Again, this money is gone and adds nothing to your equity. It is typically estimated at another 1% of the home's value per year, for a house in decent condition. And finally, you pay the cost of capital. If you borrowed money, this is the mortgage interest you pay to the bank. This is money that vanishes without building a single dollar of equity. If you paid cash for the house, this is the opportunity cost. It is the profit you would have made if that money were invested elsewhere, instead of being trapped in the walls of your home. The cost of capital is usually around 3% of the home's value when you blend mortgage interest rates and the opportunity cost of your down payment together. Add those three components, 1% for property tax, 1% for maintenance, and 3% for the cost of capital, and you get 5%. That 5% of the home's value is what you are throwing away every year as a homeowner. It is not building equity. It is not an investment. It is the annual cost of occupying that house, and it vanishes just as completely as your rent check does. The 5% rule says this: if your annual rent is less than 5% of the home's purchase price, you are better off renting. If renting costs more than 5% of the home's purchase price, buying might make sense. That is the break-even point, where the unrecoverable costs of renting equal the unrecoverable costs of owning. Let me show you how this calculation works with real numbers, because the math is shockingly simple once you see it. Take a home priced at $500,000. 5% of $500,000 is $25,000 per year, which is $2,083 per month. That is your break-even rent. If you can rent a comparable home for less than $2,083 per month, you are financially better off renting. If renting costs more than that, buying starts to make mathematical sense. Now let us apply this to real markets. In San Francisco, the median home price is approximately $1.2 million. 5% of $1.2 million is $60,000 per year, which comes out to $5,000 every single month. However, the median rent for a comparable property in San Francisco is around $3,200. $3,200 is dramatically less than $5,000, which means renting in San Francisco is significantly cheaper than buying on a pure cost basis, despite what every homeowner there will tell you about building equity. In Austin, Texas, the median home price is around $550,000. 5% of that is $27,500 per year, or $2,292 per month. Median rent for comparable properties is around $2,100. That is below the break-even point, which means renting in Austin is still cheaper than buying. In Cleveland, Ohio, the median home price is around $230,000. 5% is $11,500 per year, or $958 per month. Median rent for comparable properties is around $1,200. That is above the break-even point, which means buying in Cleveland might actually make financial sense. The 5% rule reveals something that goes against everything you have been taught. In most major American cities, especially on the coasts and in Sunbelt metros that have seen significant appreciation, renting is cheaper than buying. The people who bought in these markets are not financial geniuses building wealth. They are paying a premium for ownership that the math does not justify, and they are rationalizing it with the throwing money away narrative because that is easier than confronting the numbers. Now, you might be thinking that appreciation changes everything, that even if the annual costs of owning are higher, the house will go up in value and you will come out ahead. And this is where I need to challenge another assumption that most people treat as fact. Home prices do not always go up, and when they do go up, the returns are much lower than most people assume. According to data from Robert Shiller, the economist who won a Nobel Prize for his work on asset bubbles, the average real return on housing after adjusting for inflation is approximately 1% per year over the long term. Not 8% like stocks and not 5% like bonds, just 1%. The value of a typical home roughly keeps pace with inflation and adds only about 1% on top. That means if you buy a house for $500,000 today, in 30 years it might be worth about $675,000 in real terms. That is an increase of $175,000, or about 35% total over 3 decades. Compare that to investing in an index fund at 7% real returns. Your $500,000 would become approximately $3.8 million. The house returned $175,000 in real appreciation. The index fund returned $3.3 million in profit. People overestimate housing returns because they remember nominal prices. They remember that their parents bought a house for $60,000 and sold it for $400,000. But they forget to adjust for the 50 years of inflation in between. When you account for the falling value of the dollar, that massive gain starts to look much smaller. They also remember the exceptional markets like the Bay Area from 1990 to 2020 or Miami in the mid-2000s, without accounting for the many markets that barely kept up with inflation or actually declined. Betting your financial future on real estate appreciation is betting that your specific market will outperform the long-term average, which is a bet most people would not make if they understood what the long-term average actually is. And here is where it gets really interesting. The 5% rule already accounts for reasonable appreciation. The 3% cost of capital assumes that you are giving up investment returns by tying your money up in the house. If the house appreciates at the same rate as other assets, you break even on opportunity cost. This means you are essentially standing still compared to other investments. It is only if the house dramatically outperforms other assets that buying becomes clearly superior. And dramatically outperforming is exactly what most houses do not do over the long term. Let me talk about the hidden costs of home ownership that make the 5% rule actually conservative in many cases, because the real costs often exceed the 5% estimate. Transaction costs are enormous and usually ignored in rent versus buy calculations. When you sell a home, you pay 5 to 6% to real estate agents, plus closing costs and transfer taxes in many states. On a $500,000 home, that is $30,000 to $40,000 in transaction costs. That is money that completely evaporates and counts directly against your total returns. The timeline to break even and simply recover those massive transaction costs is typically 5 to 7 years. This means that if you are not absolutely certain that you will stay in a house for at least that length of time, buying is almost mathematically guaranteed to cost you more money than renting would have. If you own the home for only 5 years and decide to sell, those transaction costs will eat most or even all of your appreciation. In many cases, it can actually leave you underwater and in a worse financial position compared to if you had stayed a renter. Maintenance costs are chronically underestimated by new homeowners. While the 1% per year rule is a helpful average, averages often hide extreme volatility. In your first year, you might spend nothing at all, but the hidden costs are always building up. In year 6, you might suddenly have to replace the cooling system for $12,000, the roof for $15,000, and the water heater for $2,000. That is $29,000 in a single year, which is almost 6% of a $500,000 home value. The furnace, the appliances, the driveway, and even the foundation are all quietly deteriorating every day. Renters never have to think about this, because when a major system dies, they simply call the landlord. Homeowners, on the other hand, have to write painful 5-figure checks. The opportunity cost of the down payment is the largest hidden cost of home ownership, and it is the one that people typically understand the least. When you put down $100,000 on a house, that $100,000 is no longer invested in the market. If the market returns 8% and your home appreciates at only 3%, you are effectively losing 5% per year on that $100,000. That is $5,000 annually in foregone gains. Over 10 years, that is not just $50,000 lost. It is $50,000 plus the compounding you missed, which brings the real cost to over $75,000. Your down payment is not sitting safely in your house, it is sitting there slowly dying compared to what it could have been doing in equities. The 5% rule captures this in the cost of capital component. But most people never think about it consciously. They think the down payment is invested in the house. It is not. It is trapped in the house, earning the house's return instead of the market's return, and the difference compounds painfully over time. Let me be clear about when buying does make sense, because the 5% rule is not an argument that renting is always better. It is a tool for identifying when buying becomes mathematically rational. Buying makes sense when rent exceeds 5% of the home's purchase price. This happens in markets where home prices are low relative to rents, often in the Midwest, parts of the South, and smaller metros that have not experienced speculative appreciation. Buying makes sense when you are certain you will stay for at least 7 to 10 years, allowing you to recover transaction costs and reduce the per-year impact of those costs on your returns. Buying makes sense when you have maxed out all tax-advantaged investment accounts first, like your 401k, your IRA, and your HSA. Choosing a house before these means choosing a 1% real return asset over accounts that provide both market returns and tax advantages. Buying makes sense when you value the non-financial benefits enough to pay for them consciously. The stability, the ability to modify your space, the psychological ownership, and community roots while understanding exactly what premium you are paying for those benefits. The problem is not that people buy homes. The problem is that people buy homes under the delusion that they are making a financial investment when they are actually making a lifestyle purchase that often costs more than renting the equivalent property. If you want to own a home because you want to own a home because you want to paint the walls and plant a garden and never deal with a landlord, that is a valid choice. But you should make that choice with clear eyes about the financial trade-off, not with a false narrative about building wealth while renters throw money away. Here is the framework for making this decision in your own life. Because I want you to leave this video with a specific process, rather than just a general understanding. First, find the price of a home you would actually buy. Not a fantasy home, but the realistic home you would purchase in your market given your down payment, income, and preferences. Second, calculate 5% of that price and divide by 12 to get the monthly break-even rent. Third, compare that number to what you would actually pay to rent a similar property in the same area with similar space and quality. If rent is lower than the break-even number, you are financially better off renting and investing the difference. Fourth, if you are considering buying anyway, ask yourself honestly whether you will stay for at least 7 to 10 years. It is not about whether you simply hope to stay, but whether you are genuinely confident that your job, your relationships, and your life circumstances will keep you in that specific location for nearly a decade. If the answer is uncertain, the transaction costs alone will likely eat any gains from ownership. Fifth, calculate what you could accumulate by renting and investing the difference over the time period you plan to live there. Compare that liquid, accessible wealth to the illiquid home equity you would build. Most people who do this calculation honestly discover that the renting and investing path produces more net worth. They just never did the calculation because the cultural narrative told them buying was obviously superior. Right now, you probably see yourself as someone who is either a renter aspiring to be an owner or an owner who made a smart financial decision. Both of those identities are built on a narrative that may not be mathematically true. The 5% rule does not tell you exactly what to do. It tells you the absolute truth about your financial trade-off. It is a truth that the real estate industry, mortgage lenders, and your homeowning friends have no incentive to share with you. Renting is not throwing money away. Renting is paying for housing, just like owning is paying for housing, just through different channels with different cost structures. The question is not which one feels more responsible or more adult or more aligned with how your parents lived their lives. The question is which one in your specific market at your specific price point with your specific circumstances produces more wealth over the timeline that matters to you. Jason believed he was building wealth. He was actually destroying it compared to the alternative because nobody ever handed him a calculator that told the truth. Now you have that calculator. The 5% rule is simple enough to run in your head for any property you consider. And once you see the break-even line clearly, you will never again feel pressure to buy a house before the math actually makes sense. No matter how many people tell you that you are throwing money away by renting, you are not throwing money away. You are making a decision. Make that decision with numbers, not narratives. I have spent way too much time thinking about this stuff, so you do not have to. If this changed how you see renting and buying, hit that like button and subscribe. I will see you in the next one.